So good afternoon. This is Diana Arias with the Community Technical Assistance Center, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Addressing Trauma with Multigenerational Latinx Families. This is certainly an important topic, and all the more so to keep in mind as we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. We are very excited to have with us today Dr. Mercedes J. Okosi, the Clinical Director of Safe Mothers, Safe Children at NYU's McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. I'm going to turn it over to her now to introduce herself and to get us started.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Mercedes Okosi. I'm the Clinical Director at the Safe Mothers, Safe Children program here at McSilver at NYU, and also a clinician in private practice. And I'm glad that you all have come today for this very important and interesting topic. Hopefully we'll have some good questions and discussions toward the end. So I got interested in trauma because throughout my different clinical experiences, I often saw that trauma was an underlying experience across different presentations of people dealing with mental illness, and was especially interested in how some of the most marginalized populations experience particular traumas and also express trauma symptoms in their cultural context. So given Hispanic Heritage Month, we're going to talk today about particularly addressing trauma with multi-generational Latinx families, families that have some intergenerational trauma experience, and also different statuses in terms of immigration, citizenship, etc. Okay, for context quickly, given that it's Hispanic Heritage Month, we'll be using Latinx to put a little bit more emphasis on the shared culture beyond just language. So for people who aren't familiar, Hispanic is more an emphasis on Spanish-speaking populations, while as Latinx is a broader people from Latin America who share ethnicity, culture, etc. And Latinx to de-emphasize the gendered Latino, Latina. Okay. So first I have this quote to just give you all an idea of what it means for a lot of Latin communities be navigating their culture across different contexts. This is a quote from Salman Akhtar about immigration. So leaving one's country involves profound losses. Often one has to give up familiar food, native music, unquestioned social customs, and even one's language. The new country offers strange tasting food, new songs, different political concerns, unfamiliar language, pale festivals, unknown heroes, psychically unearned history, and a visually familiar and unfamiliar landscape. However, alongside the various losses is a renewed opportunity for psychic growth and alteration. And he calls this a third individuation because as people move throughout their development, there's the individuation from parent and child, individuation in terms of developing your own sense of self, and this third individuation dealing with the loss and grief and shaping of a new identity that can come with physically moving to a new country and having to deal with different customs and potentially sacrifice some of the customs and culture and familiar things from country of origin. So that will inform a lot of how we'll talk about trauma across the generations of Latinx families. Okay. In terms of what's on the agenda, we'll talk a little bit about cultural context and some commonly experienced and expressed values, types of trauma experiences that are in some cases general, but also can be unique to Latinx families, particularly immigrant families. Some data on PTSD, intergenerational or transgenerational trauma experiences, some trauma-focused interventions, the importance of cultural humility, and I'll talk a little bit about my intervention, Safe Mothers, Safe Children, as an example of a trauma-focused intervention, and we'll discuss. All right. So first, before we get into the content, to hear from you all, I would like to know what concerns arise most when you're working with multi-generational Latin families with different citizenship or immigration status. So for example, the child might be born in the US, but the parents were born in a different country of origin and maybe dealing with an undocumented status or in the process of becoming legal documented residents. So some things may be language barriers, cultural differences between an immigrant parent and a US born child, differences in values from country of origin and the US, especially when it comes to interacting with systems or socioeconomic difficulties. So we'll see what the most common responses are and get some thoughts from you all.
So I see we have some people chatting in. You should be able to see the poll pop up. It would be great if you can also answer via the poll just so that I could tally up our responses. Thank you.
So some people are saying all of the above. Lots of different answers. We'll see our poll results soon. And people are giving some other examples: distrust of providers, children having to act as interpreters, definitely part of language barriers. A lot of people are saying all of the above. Missing family who are still in the country of origin. Yeah, family separation is definitely to the point of another individuation having to deal with loss of proximity. People are saying particularly during adolescence, it can be hard to deal with having different values, not having community, etc. Okay, so the poll results, most people, or the highest response was language barriers, 32%. Second highest was cultural differences between parents and children. But people gave a lot of other important and salient examples as well. So, and a lot of people had trouble choosing between all of these. So yeah, a lot of these things are, make the context of both experiencing trauma difficult, but also seeking help, trusting that the people who are in the position to give help are culturally aware and will be affirming and safe to reach out to and access services. So we'll talk more about that. Okay. In terms of what the picture looks like, we'll talk a little bit about some stats and then some more common cultural values that you might see from Latinx families. 25% of all US children have immigrant parents, and that number is likely to continue to grow. And half of US born Latinx children have at least one immigrant parent. So this is a very common experience that the context in which the child is growing up, having both needing to be immersed in US culture when they're in school around other children and things like that, but then also having their family and community of other people in their community from their similar country of origin or their parents' country of origin, and balancing all of that can lead to some strengths and resilience, but also difficulties in the way that our systems are able to, but a lot of times unable to address those particular needs. Of course, not all of these things are set in stone, and they'll vary by family and by individual factors, but these are some of the common experiences. So according to the Office of Immigration, most undocumented Latinx immigrants who were deported had come from Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Cuba, and Brazil. And there are some values that both, like I said, give families a lot of resilience and keep families together, but can also, and I've seen in my own clinical experience, make it difficult to deal with and cope with trauma. So for example, Fatalismo is a very strong loyalty and closeness to immediate and extended family system. And on the strengths end, Fatalismo can give people a lot of immediate social support when there are positive and healthy connections within the family, shared resources in terms of like literally if people need housing, monetary resources, to know that there are people who are immediately available to extend themselves to meet those needs. But on the other end, there are some instances where Fatalismo can be to the detriment of an individual's mental health, or the family can be so attached that they are what we might consider enmeshed. And it's difficult for an individual to be able to meet their own needs because they may have to sacrifice for the family. I'm thinking of one example where one of the participants in our Safe Mother, Safe Children program had traumatic experiences at the hands of her mother, but also had her mother living with her and felt a lot of shame and guilt about the idea of asking her mother to live somewhere else because of that family loyalty, because her mother was elderly, and the also kind of value of respect for elders, but at the same time was dealing with constant trauma reminders and high hyperarousal and anxiety, knowing that she was living with the perpetrator of her abuse. And various other examples where it can be difficult to find a balance with that. Another one is machismo, which is a sometimes quite rigid gendered expectation that the man is the lead and the authority in every context. So I've seen this especially where in instances of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, where it can be very difficult for the woman in the relationship to not only voice her own needs and wants and expectations, but to even consider her own needs and desires as valid to bring up. I've also seen this happen in instances of marital sexual assault, where I've heard women say that they had never even thought to consider that sexual assault was possible within marriage because of the idea that you just do what your husband says, even if you don't want to say yes. So it can be very, definitely a contributor to trauma at its extreme. Another one is fatalismo, or a belief that fate cannot be altered. So especially when trauma or a very negative stressor happens, and this can be religiously influenced as well, the idea that it has to have happened for a reason. And that can produce a lot of shame and guilt and personalization. If someone thinks that they have to have gone through this for a reason and their path is set in stone, then they can also attach beliefs to that about being a bad person or deserving of bad things. Also, a tradition of oral history, which is also tied to a lot of the African influence in Latin America in terms of how people talk about their trauma. So a lot of parents will, of course, not be equipped necessarily in the same way as a mental health professional, but want to and think it's important to talk to their children about what happened to them and the trauma that they experienced, but can model a lot of anxiety and distress to their children and potentially expose details to their children that are developmentally inappropriate. And then another kind of gendered expectation is that the oldest daughter or daughters in general will sacrifice for the family and almost be a second mother to the younger siblings. So I've seen a lot of people, adult survivors of childhood trauma, who will talk about not really getting to experience some of the freedoms of childhood because they were expected to take care of their younger siblings. So those are some contextual kind of factors. In terms of types of trauma experiences, particular to immigrants and maybe particular to Latinx families, are actual or threatened parental detention or deportation. So the experience of feeling the need to be hypervigilant, constantly wondering how to interact with the world, and worrying about an undocumented status being revealed and there being that consequence. Exposure to community violence. A lot of the times, immigrant families will disproportionately live in neighborhoods with chronic poverty. And we know those are correlated. There will sometimes be specific political violence in the country of origin before migration. So someone can experience trauma that they're not able to process and cope with because they're on their way in terms of their migration and maybe escaping some political violence that they've witnessed or seen. And then also, of course, racial or ethnic prejudice and violence along the way or when they arrive to the US. Other types of trauma experiences, some of which anyone might experience, are life-threatening illness, physical abuse, sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, war or conflict, accidents and natural disasters, death of loved ones. And then there are acculturation challenges that may not be DSM-5 trauma, PTSD criteria, but definitely distressing and potentially compounding traumatic experiences. So things like language barriers, loss of social status. I hear a lot of not only Latinx families, but also more immigrant families across the board, that stories about someone's dad being a doctor in their country of origin and now is a taxi driver in the US, and other forms of social status that they may lose or sacrifice. Also stigma, and the challenge of acculturation. So when young people attempt to maintain high levels of both cultures, they actually report lower emotional regulation. And the challenge of acculturation itself is a challenge related to mastering the environment, which is especially important in childhood and various stages of development, in this context of school and their social lives, and through adolescence, developing their individuated identity can be really difficult to have that challenge. Most people, and when they're able to adapt, they've developed a bicultural identity in terms of honoring both their culture of origin and the cultural context that they're in based on where they live, and not necessarily trying to make them equal, but flexible and adaptive and more authentic to their identity. In terms of some data, 17.8% of Americans are of Latin origin. This is from the 2016 US Census estimate. 70% of adults report a traumatic life event in general, and 67% of adults report adverse childhood experiences like abuse, neglect, or household challenges. 11% of adults with adverse childhood events are Latinx. And while that number might seem a little bit low in terms of the proportion of the population versus who reports these ACEs, a lot of the time the data can reflect not reporting and difficulty making estimates accurate because people feel stigma or fear about reporting. But that gives us an idea. In terms of lifetime prevalence of exposure to any traumatic event, it varies by ethnic group. So about 68% of Latinx people will have at least one exposure to a traumatic event. The average is around 70. And in terms of actually developing post-traumatic stress disorder, we see here that Latinx people are a little bit above average, but again, could be that there are issues in reporting and making these estimates accurate, especially given what we know about how people are impacted by their status in terms of traumas related to race and ethnicity and immigration status. What was interesting is that the research suggests that the conditional risk for PTSD is higher among Latinx than non. So Black, white, or combined comparison group of non-Latin origin. Conditional risk meaning that there's a high rate of exposure to trauma, but they can be less likely to report symptoms that will meet the diagnosis. And there's also a different cultural expression of symptoms. So although there's higher exposure, of course, the diagnosis of a mental illness is in the context of where that's being defined and what's seen as the norm or outside of the norm in terms of how that's expressed. So if someone who's of Latinx origin describes their symptoms in a more somatic way, in terms of like how the distress physically presents in their body, it may not represent exactly the PTSD criteria that we will use to diagnose. Or even if someone uses different language, that's like a cultural expression of like a cultural symptomatology, like ataque de nervios or something like that. They may be experiencing that as a response to trauma, but depending on how their professional that they're talking to interprets that, they may not map that onto what we know as the PTSD diagnosis. So a lot of things that need to be culturally specific to capture accurate data. And then PTSD symptoms can worsen when they're compounded by multiple traumatic events and also dissociation and shame as a response. In terms of intergenerational or transgenerational trauma, I'll give different examples, but this is a process where the trauma that either a direct parent experienced or like down a long line of generations have experienced impacts the way that they express themselves and model certain emotional regulation or dysregulation or patterns of behavior to children. The way that they adapt their parenting style can be impacted by trauma or multiple generations of trauma in an individual family. But then there are also historical traumas that whole generations of a particular ethnic group may have experienced, like a war, colonization, etc. So parents who have more adverse childhood events have increased parenting distress, leading to their children often having worse mental health outcomes. A lot of times they call this like the immigrant paradox, where most of the time we hear the story of the immigrant person coming to the US for hope and change and opportunities, especially to have better opportunities for their children. But a lot of the times when trauma is involved, there can be worse mental health outcomes in terms of increased distress on their parenting skills, but also the challenge of the child to try to adapt to the new environment. So the caregiver's effectiveness can be compromised. They found that compromised caregiver effectiveness of parents and grandparents who immigrated was a feature of intergenerational trauma. When parents had unresolved trauma, grief, anxiety, depression, that kept them from meeting their children's emotional needs. So sometimes the mental illness of a parent can be traumatic in itself for the child. And they can, like I said, model off of the same kind of expressions or lack of expressions of and coping with emotions. Particularly with trauma, I've seen and heard a lot of examples of a parent's anxiety and hypervigilance, modeling for the child that the world and other people are to be feared and scary, and they will also have some anxious reactions sometimes. Higher rates of PTSD and both internalizing and externalizing issues, behavioral issues, were found in citizen children of undocumented adults, especially when they had contact with immigration services. So if you can think from the point of view of a child who is experiencing trauma in itself in the form of the potential threat or actually experiencing a parent being taken away, having the limited, depending on their age, limited language to express their distress. So it coming out in terms of behavioral issues. A lot of the times, which, especially in a school system, may not be accurately identified as a trauma response. And then also, as I mentioned, passing down the cultural narrative of historical trauma can be distressing in itself. To hear about some of those stories and experiences. So even in the fetal environment, when a pregnant person experiences trauma, it can happen that the child will then have abnormally low cortisol levels, which leads to them having an inadequate stress response. So think of the features of PTSD that are like numbing and dissociation. On the other hand, abnormally high cortisol levels lead to hyperarousal and abnormal physiological rhythms. So think of the like hyperarousal and anxious side of PTSD. This is also part of the emerging research on like epigenetics in terms of how a parent's genes respond to the environment, and then how those different physiological features can be passed down to the child. So tracking through cortisol levels is one example, among other kinds of research with epigenetics. And then, like I said, telling the narrative. So when telling children about trauma narratives, parents, grandparents, whoever can model distress and emotional dysregulation. And especially when the adult survivor of trauma reports that their worst traumatic event was a childhood trauma, there can be lower levels of acculturation and higher PTSD symptoms. So a parent can be an adult survivor of childhood trauma, carry that with them unresolved, and then impact future generations with higher PTSD symptoms. So now we'll talk about interventions, because there's a lot of avenues that one can experience traumatic events and have an experience of distress and PTSD. But then what do we do? Someone said, what does WTE stand for? WTE is worst traumatic event. So yeah, when people reported that their worst traumatic event was in childhood, they had worse PTSD symptoms. Okay. This is another quote that I found really interesting in terms of the challenge of living across multiple identities and how different parts of, especially something like language, can be expressed in different contexts of someone's lives. So this was a Mexican-American poet named Guillermo Gómez Peña. And he said, I remember speaking in tongues since I was 12, always wondering whether I was mad or enlightened. Either or, I remember things in English or in Spanish. English for politics, Spanish for love. English for praxis, Spanish for theory. English for survival, Spanish for laughter. English for time, Spanish for space. English for art, Spanish for literature. So, and I experienced this even when I am working with people who are bilingual, sometimes people who are only speak Spanish and are trying to learn English, that there are some things that just can't be expressed the same way that one would like to express them in their native language that's attached to like memories, experiences, strong emotional connections, and like attachments to people and things that they became familiar with when they were learning their first language in context. So there are all of these different factors that we have to think about when thinking about how people might express both their distress and their healing dealing with trauma. And sometimes even when people become more fluent in English, I've seen that there's just like a preference to express something in Spanish. Okay, so y'all may be familiar with several types and tenets of trauma-focused interventions. I think the most important thing, particularly with trauma, is establishing safety. So when we think about traumatic experiences, someone has gone through the ultimate feeling of unsafety, whether it was something unpredictable or uncontrollable in their world that happened, like a natural disaster, or especially a lot of the times if it's an interpersonal trauma, like the physical violation of their body and their safety. A lot of people are constantly living in a survival mode, constantly feeling unsafe. And so to establish safety through a good therapeutic alliance is the foundation, I think, of any trauma therapy that's going to be effective. But then other skills and components are important too, like emotional awareness and regulation, crisis and distress tolerance, managing those, learning coping skills, narrative exposure or processing to get over the avoidance as a reinforcer of trauma symptoms, and then examining relationship and attachment patterns, including their parenting. A lot of people that I work with will maybe not initially have a clear idea of how trauma is affecting all of their areas of their life, but they will say, I don't want my kids to experience what I've experienced, or I don't want my kids to be afraid or have the feelings that I have. I want their lives to be different. All right, so of course, there are some systemic things like school-based interventions or incorporating trauma screening into primary care. So for people who may have a lot of hesitance or understandable skepticism toward seeking out mental health specifically, there are a lot of social emotional learning interventions that can be and should be culturally adapted to work with these populations. And then also, like I said, sometimes people who have culturally different understandings of symptoms of mental illness will express them somatically or physically. So if, well, getting people connected to primary care in the first place is also, can be a challenge. But if people are going to go to the doctor, having their primary care physician be versed in screening and talking about trauma so that it becomes a regularly trauma-informed practice can help cope with a lot of these things. But there's also different interventions like multifamily groups, family systems therapy, trauma-focused CBT, and narrative exposure therapy. I'll play a little of this video because I thought it was an interesting and creative example of some elders in the community doing like a dramatic narrative drama therapy to talk about their trauma. So we can watch a little bit of this. Hopefully it plays fine. There we go.
Caminé durante 2 días y 3 noches, hasta tomando agua de charcos. El nombre del proyecto es Teatro Jornalero Sin Fronteras, y Teatro Jornalero Sin Fronteras es un proyecto.
Oh, sorry.
Hasta tomando agua de charcos. El nombre del proyecto es Teatro Jornalero Sin Fronteras, y Teatro Jornalero Sin Fronteras es un proyecto que brinda voz e imagen a una comunidad que en este país no tiene voz e imagen, los jornaleros y las trabajadoras de casa.
Por jornada, o sea, trabajamos al diario, ¿no? Nos contratan por un día, por 2 días, por horas, y el proyecto es llevar a los jornaleros a descubrir en sí que tienen un potencial, ¿no? Quizás a descubrir que también podemos participar en arte y no ser solamente jornaleros.
Los traumas del pasado lo afectan a uno mentalmente, y el teatro es como una terapia especial para sacar todo aquello que te hace mal mentalmente. Es muy bueno el teatro.
Te digo, antes era una persona muy aislada, muy solitaria, muy callado, y estar participando en el teatro pues me llevó un poquito a desenvolverme más con la demás gente, ¿no? A relacionarme con más personas.
El teatro y las artes escénicas permitieron ser una terapia de vida para poder sobrellevar todo el traumatismo que generó el venir a este país, el dejar a mi familia y el tratar de incorporarme a una cultura y a una sociedad tan diferente. Me apegué caminando al lado del coyote para no perderme en la densa oscuridad. ¿Qué hace?
Déjame ayudarte.
No,
No seas necia.
te digo que no.
Says here during this country, illegally is.
Don't I get a lawyer?
Soy el hijo de un señor, ¿no? Que se escapa de su casa por problemas familiares, me vengo a Estados Unidos. Después mi papá viene a buscarme, lo encuentro y hay cierto rencor con mi papá por no haberme soportado en mi adolescencia. En parte sí tiene mucha similitud con mi vida personal. Es básicamente mi historia.
Son familiares. Mi hijo, Father Santim, ¿cómo? ¿Quiere volver a su país, señor? Mire encontrar a mi hijo. Wow, it looks like you found him.
Nunca imaginé llegar a hacer esto, a estar parado en un escenario frente a gente, haciendo algo que creo que puedo hacerlo.
Okay. So I thought that was a good example of like the community itself, figuring out the most effective way for them to process their feelings. It's something that I was new to me in terms of like a community-based drama theater, drama therapy experience. So I think as much as we can listen to the what people are saying they need and how they're what they imagine can be healing for them, to incorporate that into our interventions and support those things. So you see they're expressing and learning how to cope with feelings related to the traumas of immigration, but then also developing a skill of acting. And yeah. All right, so some protective factors or resilience factors that can aid trauma-focused interventions are, of course, higher maternal education, father employment, affordable and accessible, culturally relevant social services. There's been so many times where like I'll be working with someone and their case planner barely can speak Spanish well. And so even just like basic language things can be lacking sometimes. Healthy family and community support, stable housing and food, access to healthcare, positive relationships with others, etc. So when we can, in our roles, help to provide those things or facilitate those things, even though they are, well, because they are basic needs, can of course improve mental health or people's ability to participate in mental health treatment. So now we'll talk a little bit about cultural humility and people starting to feel healed the moment that they're heard. A lot of times people will talk about cultural competence as like a skill. But I think that regardless of how much you learn about a population, even if you're from the same population, it won't be the same as developing a stance of cultural humility where you're able to be open and curious and also open to being wrong about your cultural understanding. So a lot of the time, culturally validated screeners aren't used, just like random translations of screens that exist that will not make sense as direct translations. A lot of Latinx youth are less likely to be screened in the first place. In terms of the power dynamics that can happen, it's important to remember the individual or the family are experts on their own experience, and to be willing to be challenged or be wrong or about some assumptions you may have. And offering interventions as options or additional tools to empower patients or families, as opposed to like, this is the correct American, US white point of view of things to do, and your values or your practices are wrong. And a lot of the times it can be difficult to have someone learn something new and it feel like what they're accustomed to is being taken away. So they feel some sense of powerlessness. But if you offer a new intervention as an addition or a tool, it can allow people to feel like they have options and choices. So I'll briefly talk about the context of my work. In child welfare, most children, more than half, waiting to be adopted are children of color. And of course, there's an understandable mistrust of the system of child welfare. The Safe Mother, Safe Children program gets our referrals from preventive agencies where most of the population are women of color, Black and Latinx, living in poverty. So we screen them for trauma and do a full assessment. They're randomized into supportive counseling or Ptsd, which is PC care and trauma narrative therapy. And then we do multiple assessment points to track their progress on PTSD symptoms and parenting skills. So we definitely see a lot of the intergenerational trauma effects. And so far, the intervention based on the pilot study data has been successful. 78% no longer met PTSD criteria, and 39% achieved full remission after the follow-up, and 85% no longer met criteria for depression. There was also less child behavioral problems and increased positive parenting skills. And I think that's due to having culturally relevant and empirically tested and translated assessment materials, as well as cultural humility in the work. So I'll say a little bit about an example where a lot of the things I've highlighted so far are illustrated. So Ms. M was a 40-year-old Dominican, Spanish-speaking woman in the Bronx. She had 7 children and 6 of them lived with her. And her 3-year-old child participated with us in the Safe Mother, Safe Children treatment. She had many traumas throughout her life, including a lot of interpersonal trauma, abuse, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and had a lot of the classic symptoms of PTSD, like unwanted memories, flashback, physical reactions, lack of interest, difficulty with memory, being distant from others, etc. And then caused her a lot of distress and feeling of powerlessness. So during the Safe Mother, Safe Children intervention of Ptsd, she incorporated skills like deep breathing and even taught them to her children. She ended up outside of our program also doing yoga and stretching and felt more able to experience a range of emotions without judging herself. She processed a lot of the experience through the narrative portion of the therapy that had originally left her feeling very empty, but felt more in control and liberated, being able to access the memories, but know that she could cope with and deal with the feelings. So in the end, she had a very large reduction in her trauma and depression, no longer had PTSD, and felt safer and able to keep her daughter safe. She said, "I feel liberated being able to talk about what happened, and I know I can speak up for myself." So this was a case where there were a lot of the extremes of some of the customs in her culture that she was used to. She was in a marriage where she thought that she couldn't say no to sexual intercourse, in situations where she was forced to get an abortion that she didn't want to get, and had felt like a lot of the loyalty to her husband or partners in the past and family left her with not feeling in control of her own life. So being able to process those things and have someone who could be understanding of her cultural experience. Okay, so these are some discussion questions that may help to guide the Q&A and other questions you may have. So it'll be interesting to know how and when you've had to consider these intergenerational differences in your works with Latinx families. What new information or practices or thoughts will you take into your future work? And are there ways that your own ethnic identity informs your work with Latinx families? So things to think about. I also have my contact information here for NYU, if you want to learn more about the Safe Mother, Safe Children project, and then also my practice website. And yeah, I believe, Diana, you'll say a little bit about the CTAC information. But thank you all for sticking with me.
Thank you so much, Mercedes. Yes, really appreciate it. So yeah, we do have a couple of questions that came in for you, but maybe we can go back to the contact slide for you. So let me bring up some of those questions here. So I think there was a lot of feedback to the video, and Nicole was nice enough to actually put that in the chat box. We can certainly try to put that back up again on the chat box as well. So I think people were just saying, yeah, it's a really great example of having that perspective from the actual individuals themselves as opposed to us sort of speaking to and putting our own perspective onto things. So a couple of questions that did come up, Sadie's. I know we have just a few minutes. What are some examples of culturally adapted interventions? Can you talk about how they were developed? Is one of the questions that came in.
Yeah, so in the most basic sense, a lot of the research that goes behind measures and instruments will use like white, historically at least, definitely like white men as the population, but then generalize it to everyone else. So you want to be able to make sure like who was the population that the researchers used when they normed and adapted this to go out into the public. For example, when we were choosing which translation to go with for our trauma assessment, there are multiple different translations, even based on like slight differences in language. So for example, there was a Spanish translation that was from Spain, and there was a Spanish translation from Mexico, and then I believe one other like Puerto Rican one. So we looked at where in the Safe Mother, Safe Children program, where are most of our Spanish speaking population coming from? It wouldn't make sense to give them the Spanish translation from Spain because even some words can be unfamiliar or slightly off because there are variations in how people speak Spanish. And then also how you use the instrument. So being aware of how, what people may or may not be familiar with and giving them some of the power to define and express things for themselves when you're assessing them. So
great, thank you. So a couple of questions or comments around the need for culturally relevant or culturally adapted interventions. Is there sort of a site where people can go for these? There was also a question around, some of the interventions that were discovered, in terms of Safe Mother, Safe Children. Where can people go for that? Is there a database of sorts for culturally adapted interventions or even assessments? There was also a question around, where we could go for assessments.
Yeah, I'm not aware of a particular database that has like a range of assessments that have already been verified as culturally adaptive. But I think definitely looking into the particular measures, I even for myself now want to know the answer to that about if there's one place. It would be nice if there's one place to go to know that like to have all that information gathered there in one place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly there is a need for that. So I think that there definitely should be a push for that. In terms of the scenario that you gave, someone commented and said, shouldn't it be an ongoing therapy to routinely give her updates and possibly a role on new family members going through the same past experiences? So just wondering if that is an option.
So in the case example that I gave, our intervention is time limited, especially because it's clinical research. So it was 23 sessions. But after that, we do refer people out if they're wanting to continue therapy, and refer them out to places in the community that we know work with these populations and will be trusted. If we could follow people for extended periods of time, that would be great, but we end up referring them out. I also think it's important too with any therapy to know that when someone gains some more independence and feels like that part of their work is done, to be able to honor that. So.
Great, thank you. And I do see that there's a lot of comments, in terms of where to go for some culturally adaptive assessments here and there. So just calling people's attention also to the chat box. I think this is an opportunity for us to learn from each other and certainly support each other in the work that we do. So thank you to the folks that are also participating via the chat. Mercedes, I believe there was some on the website. So we are going to be putting the recording and the slides on our website in the next 2 to 3 days. So I am mindful of time. Were there some resources that you also wanted to be uploaded? And if so, I'm wondering if we can maybe talk about those or just introduce those to folks.
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to share was the Working Alliance inventory. So it's in English and Spanish, and there's one both for the clinician and the client or patient, to get an idea of, as you're working together, do you have similar goals? What are your perspectives of each other? And gauge something you can use throughout your treatment to gauge how the strength of the alliance and what things can be improved.
Great, thank you. So it definitely seems like getting feedback from individuals, which I think sometimes we forget to do at times. So I think you had mentioned earlier on, right, also sort of tailoring things, obviously culturally adaptive or appropriate for folks. Thank you. So on our next slide, I know we are sort of at time, but on our next slide here, I did just want to also highlight that here at CTAC, we have some available resources that are directly in Spanish. So these are 3 examples. We have an ACEs brochure for caregivers. We have tips for clinicians working with child trauma survivors, as well as adult trauma survivors. Those can be found on our ctacny.org website. If you go under tools, you should be able to download those. So we have them available in English as well as in Spanish. On our next slide, I do just want to highlight some of our upcoming events for the month of October. And on our very next final slide, I do want to take the time to thank you, Mercedes, for such an informative webinar. There has been a lot of comments from participants saying it certainly is an important topic, and they certainly enjoyed your presentation. If you need to reach out to us, please feel free to visit our website. There is also a link for a feedback form that should be opening up on your window. Please take the time to fill that out. This webinar came about from, your feedback as well. Certainly, there's been a gap in this particular topic, so we certainly attended to that via this offering. So again, thank you to our audience members, and thank you so much to Dr. Okosi. Appreciate you taking the time, and everyone, please have a good rest of the day.